Good evening, everyone. We're pleased to be bringing you tonight's science seminar, How to Protect Earth's Biological Diversity, Lessons from Maitreya Buddha, Pharma Bros, and Yucca Mountain. For those of you who are not familiar with the Academy, I'd like to take just a moment to tell you a bit about who we are. We are an independent science organization supported entirely through community contributions. At venues throughout the region, we connect science and the community through free and or very low cost public talks, science seminars and workshops, and trips and tours that feature scientists and engineering professionals of both national and international renown. In addition to advancing the public understanding of science, it's our mission to inspire the next generation of scientists and science advocates, which we do by offering a full array of free and low-cost opportunities expressly for teens, such as our Teen Science Cafes, STEM Teens Youth Leadership Council, Junior Academy of Science, and the Regional Academy of Science St. Louis Science Fair and its Honors Division. The Junior Academy is a pre-professional STEM membership organization for students from the full range of academic backgrounds in grades 6 through 12 that offers hands-on opportunities in science, engineering, and medicine. Teens can attend unique behind-the-scenes explorations of leading engineering, technology, and science labs of our region, and participate in field opportunities and challenging and engaging science competitions. Now, all offered virtually online. And Junior Academy members also make real-world connections, meeting top STEM professionals. You can find more information on the Junior Academy and all of our community-wide science events and programs by visiting our website at academyofsciencestl.org. You may also visit us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can sign up to receive Academy e-news on our website, again at academyofsciencestl.org, or jot your email address down in the online program survey, which will pop up in the chat a couple times this evening before you leave. I do want to mention one event that you might have an interest in attending. On Thursday evening, November 19 at 7 p.m. via Zoom, you can join us for Oceans Ahoy, NASA's plans to explore the subsurface seas of the outer solar system's icy satellites with Dr. William McKinnon. He is a professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences with the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences and the McDonnell Center for the Space Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. This event is free and open to the public, and you can register for the Zoom link to join on our website at academyofsciencestl.org events. With that said, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Adam Smith. Dr. Smith is an associate scientist of global change ecology with the Center for Conservation and Sustainable Development at the Missouri Botanical Garden. He earned his undergraduate degree in biology from McPherson College, his master's in ecology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his Ph.D. in energy and resources from the University of California, Berkeley. His research addresses the impacts global change will have on individual species and their communities, and means by which human intervention can facilitate adaptive responses. His current research involves estimating the climate change vulnerability of threatened plant species of the North American Central Highlands, the Ozarks, the Ouachitas, and Tennessee's Central Basin. In previous work, he has addressed the transferability of species distribution models across time spans relevant to conservation, community assembly, applications of the species area relationship in conservation, and marine conservation policy. Much of his research involves modeling and field work. A dominant theme of his work has been the development and application of models that predict the response of species to climate change, habitat loss, and expropriation by humans, with a related theme addressing how environmental factors like climate limit species ranges. We are pleased to have him here with us tonight for this very important conversation on how conservation biologists can learn from efforts across societies and history to ensure things of value persist for a long time. Won't you please join me in welcoming Dr. Adam Smith?
Regardless of whether you believe that it's important to wear a mask when you go outside or not, regardless of whether you voted red or blue, I think we can all agree that this is, in a sense, a time of trouble. This is a time of great anxiety. It's a time of great change. And I want to tell you the good news, and that is one day it will end, it'll become better. And I want to tell you something else that's more surprising. This all began in the year 1052. Well, at least according to some. So 1052 was the zenith of, in some sense, courtly life in Japan. It was a watershed year. On the one hand, beauty was held in very high esteem. People powdered their faces to become more pale. They blackened their teeth. Women wore robes with up to 12 different layers. It was a time of great patronage of the arts, of literature and poetry and music. In fact, the world's first novel, Genji no Monogatari, or Tale of Genji, was written by a woman, Murasaki Shikubu. On the other hand, it was a time of great strife. There were an enormous number of volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, earthquakes. It was the first time in living memory that Buddhist law was not being observed. And they calculated that it had been 2,000 years since the birth of Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha. And according to their calendar, they believed that that was then the end of the age of Dharma. And the year 1052 marked the beginning of the year of the age of Mappo. And during the age of Mappo, things would not go aright. It would be a time of great anxiety. It'd be a time of great upheaval. All adherence to the law would fall by the wayside, and society itself would collapse. And worst of all, nobody could actually be enlightened. Until one day, the Maitreya Buddha would come back. And Maitreya Buddha, alighting on the earth, would take up the Lotus Sutra and preach 3 sermons from that scroll. And in so doing, usher in an age of enlightenment. And so the medieval Japanese set upon themselves the task of ensuring that the Lotus Sutra would be preserved. And to do that, they copied the Lotus Sutra onto parchment. They copied it onto stone. They used traditional ink. They used ink made from silver. They used ink made from gold, mixed sometimes with the blood of the calligrapher himself. And they buried these scrolls underground in stupas for a time that would come sometime in the future. They believed 5,670,000,000 years from now. 5,670,000,000 years from now, which honestly is absurd. The Earth will have been swallowed by the sun as it becomes a red giant by then. You can't get paper to last that long, let alone stone or anything else. But that's not the point. The point isn't that their society, they saw this as an existential crisis that they could do something about. In our society, the only people talking about billions of years from now are astrophysicists. And personally, I think that needs to change. And I'll tell you why. What I want to do for you tonight is paint a picture of vistas. Now, normally we think of vistas as something like this. You're standing atop a mountain and you're looking out in the distance into a place that perhaps you can't even reach. But I want to paint you a different picture of a vista. In this case, a picture of a vista through time. We are standing at a particular point in time where we're looking out across time to places or to times when we won't be alive, and perhaps even society that we live in won't be around. And to illustrate what I want to talk about, I'm going to give you 3 different story arcs. First one, year 50, Nero and the heart. The ancient city of Cyrene was one of the most important Grecian cities while it was in existence. It is found in the southern Mediterranean, which is in the area which is now Libya. It was so prominent they invented their own school of philosophy called Cyrenianism, which emphasized short-term intense pleasure as opposed to anticipatory pleasure or pleasure that you might remember. And perhaps one of the contributions towards Cyrenianism was this. Not the coin, but the actual plant imprinted upon the coin. This, we believe, is a picture of silphium. Silphium was a plant that was widely traded around the Mediterranean area. It was said to be worth its weight in gold, perhaps even silver. And yet it only grew in a narrow swath along the coast close to the city of Cyrene. And Cyrene enjoyed the economic bounty brought by this plant. It was incredibly an incredible source of wealth because it was a contraceptive, a natural contraceptive used by the ancient Greeks. And perhaps because of that, it became associated with romance. In fact, its seeds, we believe, were in the shape of the heart, or rather, The heart is in the shape of its seeds, and we carry them around today, perhaps in little lockets around our necks. Alas, silphium was so valuable, it was harvested to the point of near extinction within a few centuries, even though there are laws passed regulating its harvest. It eventually functionally died out, and the city of Cyrene fell by the wayside. The last one was, perhaps apocryphally, given to the Emperor Nero in the year 50, and he promptly ate it. Arc number 2, September 1st, 1914, F flat, G flat, G. The passenger pigeon was once the world's most abundant bird. Some people say the passenger pigeon numbered somewhere between 3 billion, perhaps 5 billion birds, maybe even up to 12 billion birds. When they migrated, you could hear the flock coming minutes before you could see them. And when they arrived, they flew overhead, sometimes for days on end. John James Audubon relates at least one account where the entire flock lasted 3 days flying overhead, darkening the sky. Perhaps because of that, it was incredibly easy to harvest the bird. All you had to do was shoot up into the sky and 5 or 6 would fall down. It became an incredibly bountiful exercise to harvest. People captured them, they trapped them, they netted them, they took them to cities for live target practice. And it was inconceivable that the bird would go extinct because it was so abundant. Nevertheless, sometime around in the 1850s, there were laws that started to be passed regulating its harvest. They were roundly ignored. In 1868, the largest roosting of the passenger pigeon nested somewhere close to Petoskey, Michigan. And for 5 months, for every day, about 50,000 birds were taken from that roosting. Within about 2 or 3 decades, you could make a pretty penny by capturing just 2 or 3 birds. They were so valuable. There was an incredible reward put forth for them by several different societies. And in 1912, the last one died in Cincinnati Zoo. We do not have very much left of the passenger pigeon, just memories. One of them is what it sounded like. This is, in a sense, a recording taken by William Craig in 1911. He says, in this species, as in all other pigeons, the female is comparatively a very quiet bird. The following few notes, notations 28 to 31, are all I have of the voice of the female. Number 28, not loud, a clucking sound, given on alighting on perch among the band-tailed pigeons who drove her off. From the most abundant bird to 1 bird to 0. 2080, Madagascar. If you wanted to go to, say, another planet that was like Earth and had life like Earth, and yet its clock of evolution was wound completely differently, you could almost do no better than going to Madagascar. Almost every single species in Madagascar is found only on the island. 83% of all plants are endemic to the island of Madagascar. They can be found nowhere else in the world. And of them, some plants are even more specialized. So 95% of all trees are only found, that are found in Madagascar are only found there. 99% of all amphibians, 92% of all reptiles, 100% of all mammals, the lemurs, except for the bats, and I know you care about them, 93% of all the ticks found in Madagascar can only be found on the island. And a very large portion of that biodiversity is dependent upon the rainforest, which runs along the eastern side of the island. So a few years ago, a dear friend of mine, Tony Lynn Morelli, approached me. She was interested in understanding the climate change vulnerability of some of the lemurs that she studied. But Madagascar is almost synonymous with deforestation. When Europeans arrived a few centuries ago, the island was lush with forest. And we don't know how much has been lost since then. Some people say 50% is what's remaining. Some people say only 5% is what is remaining. But nevertheless, deforestation has continued apace. And so we talked about it, and I said, well, if we're going to look at how climate change affects the lemurs, we also need to understand how deforestation will affect them. So I constructed a model of deforestation of Madagascar. And that's what you see here on the left. So I've highlighted the area where the rainforest is found. That's the light gray area. The dark gray area also has forest, but I didn't focus on that. And of course, the green represents the forest cover in the year 2014. So I'm going to play you a short video year by year going from 2014 to the year 2080. And personally, I found it difficult to look back and forth between the forest and the year. So what I'm going to ask you to do is focus on any green place. It doesn't really matter where. And as the decades go by, I will call off the year. Let's do that again. 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050, 2060, 2070, 2080. It's all gone. No matter what I did with the model, I could not get the rainforest to persist past the year 2080. I used the most optimistic, that is the lowest rate of observed deforestation in the data that I had, and I could not get the model to allow the forest to persist past the year 2080. Now, I want to emphasize that this forest has been there for tens of millions of years. Madagascar itself has been separated from the rest of the landmass of the earth for 70 to 80 different million years. And yet it could all be done. It could be all emptied of forest in the next century. I also want to emphasize that this is not a prediction. I'm not saying this will happen. It's a scenario. It's based on decisions that humans are making. And one of those decisions, I'm happy to say, has been made by my home institution, the Missouri Botanical Garden. We have a number of protected areas or parks that we help manage. These are living parks. They aren't places where people are kept out of. Rather, some of them actually have villages in them, and we are working with the villagers there to ensure that the forest persists. And although they are small, you can see the outlines of some of them here on the map. Although they are small, they are very strategically placed, and together they actually hold about half of the island's plant diversity. So these three story arcs illustrate the conundrum that I want to talk about tonight. On the one hand, we have things that could persist in a sense forever. On the other hand, they could go extinct within decades. Perforce, right now, the world over, about 1 in 8 birds is in danger of extinction. 1 in 4 mammals is in danger of extinction, and of them, our cousins, primates, about 1 in 2 is in danger of extinction. 1/3 of all amphibians is in danger of extinction, although my friends who did this kind of assessment say it's actually more like 1 in 2. 37% of all hard corals. Sea turtles almost don't get a circle. Of course, almost all life on Earth depends on plants. 1 in 5 plants is in danger of extinction, although honestly, a new report just came out saying it's 2 in 5, so this graphic is a little bit out of date. And of those plants, some groups are highly endangered. For example, 1/3 of all conifers, which includes pine trees, and 3/4 of all cycads, an ancient order of plants, is in danger of extinction. Now, we often talk about climate change, but honestly, almost all these species I've noted here that are in danger of extinction are in danger not because of climate change yet, but because of other activities. So even if there were not anthropogenic climate change, we would still have on our hands an extinction crisis. And we have no comprehension of the timescales of the impact we are having. To illustrate that, I want you to consider the time span of human experience. And one way to measure that is, of course, to look at the typical human lifespan. It might go from about 40 years to 80 years, depending on what time or what era or what place you live in. But it's fairly short compared, for example, to the ocean quahog, a very long-lived mollusk living in the ocean. But that pales in comparison to other metrics of the human experience. One of those metrics might be the length of human society, how long it lasts. So the average lifespan of a human society is about 3 centuries, 3 1/3 centuries. But if we look at the longest lived societies or empires in history, they clock in at a little bit over 1,000 years. The neither Holy nor Roman nor Empire lasted for 1,006 years. The Byzantine Empire just goes to demonstrate that bureaucracy is not necessarily a bad thing. And the Kushite kingdom of Sudan lasted over 1,100 years. But this is short in comparison to other measures of the human experience. So Judaism is one of the longest lived organized religions. Of course, if you include shamanism and folk religion, then it can go back tens of thousands of years. We've been writing for about 6,000 years, and those are on the time scale of the lifespan of an individual bristlecone pine tree found in California and Nevada. And yet, those are fairly short in comparison to other measures of the human experience. We've been working with metals for about 10,000 years. In fact, Isaac Asimov actually postulated that gold was the first metal that we started to deal with because it's fairly soft, and all you really need is a rock to pound it. So we might be underestimating the time with which we've been dealing with metals. Agriculture began about 10,000 years ago with the founding of the so-called 8 founder crops, which includes wheat and barley and chickpeas. And yet those are on the lifespan or the time scale of an individual Antarctic beech tree. And yet those are short in comparison to other measures of the human experience. We've been domesticating dogs for the last 30 to 40,000 years. And to be honest with you, after all that time, they still bark, they still bite, they still sniff your crotch. In my book, I feel like it's been a complete waste. Obviously, I'm a cat person, but have that as what you will. We've been speaking for about 50,000 years. And perhaps even before that. So our measure of time, in some sense, goes back tens of millennia. And yet, that is really short in comparison to how long we have been here. As humans, as Homo sapiens, we've been on Earth for the last 200,000 to 300,000 years, which honestly, if you think about the uncertainty in that, it's kind of like saying, I don't know if I'm 20 years old or 30 years old. Most of our history we have no memory of whatsoever. And yet we are a very young species in comparison to the potential lifespan of most species on Earth. So the average mammal persists for about 1 million to 2 million years. The average species persists for about 3 million years or so, and diatoms can clock in at over 8 million years. Now, Earth's life has experienced over the course of its history numerous extinction events. And some of these are fairly minor. They're often caused, say, for example, when two land masses collide together and they, in a sense, erase the sea between them, wiping out whatever is living in them. And some of them are massive. They're caused by perhaps meteorite impacts or volcanic eruptions, which lead to climate change. Regardless of the size of the extinction event, it takes at least 30 million years to recover, at least 30 million years to re-evolve the same number. Of course, you're never going to re-evolve the same species, but re-evolve the same number of species. This is effectively forever. And on human timescales, in terms of the timescales that we're used to experiencing and thinking about, this is eternal. So this is the central problem I want to address tonight. How can we assure the persistence of biodiversity across eternal timescales, given that we are often focused on what we're going to do tomorrow or the next fiscal quarter or the next election cycle or something like that? Our decision-making process is not up to the task, but it has to be. Well, one of the solutions to passing on, in a sense, biodiversity to future generations is simply to tell them about it. After all, we write books, we make movies, we have podcasts and things like that. But language is a really poor medium for transmitting these kind of messages. And here's an example showing you why. This is Chaucer. I believe this is the section where he's talking about the night. And he says, in elders both wisdom and usage, men made the old and train and not a tree. This is Middle English. And although we can get the gist of that, honestly, I can't tell you what it really means. Translated to modern English, It comes out as a knife aphorism. Youth may outrun the old, but not outwit. And translated to very modern English emoji, it looks perhaps something like this. Youth may outrun the old, but not outwit. So you can see across very short time scales, just a few centuries, language can change incredibly. So language is not a good way to transmit the value of biodiversity, except sometimes that it is. So humans have been on the island of Australia for somewhere between 60,000 and 47,000 years. And during that time, a really intricate tradition of oral transmission of history has been developed. And for a long time, Western anthropologists heard these stories and figured that they were figurative or they were intended to teach a lesson or something like that. Until one day, an astrophysicist began to listen a little more closely, and he realized that perhaps this wasn't just a made-up story. Perhaps it was telling something that was true. And the story goes like this, and I'm quoting here: a fiery devil ran down from the sun and made his home in the earth. He will burn and eat any bad fellows. And upon further investigation, this astrophysicist discovered that the Aborigines have tales of certain villages that were wiped out by this fiery devil and other villages that witnessed the event but were spared from the fire. And that the Aborigines actually knew where this event occurred. And when they took them to it, they knew exactly where it was because it was in Henbury Meteorite Conservation Reserve, which holds a number of meteorite impact craters. And when they dated those craters, they found the impacts occurred 4,700 years ago. This is oral tradition that has kept that story alive for millennia. In fact, the Aborigines actually have stories of sea level rise caused by the melting of glaciers elsewhere on Earth. They talk about how they used to be able to reach a certain island and then it became inaccessible due to the fact that the sea rose up. So perhaps words can transmit important messages so long as the culture itself remains intact. But even then, words themselves sometimes still do fail. March 11th, 2011, so to speak, the pillars under the island nation of Japan began to shake. And over the course of 6 minutes, the entire island of Honshu, the main island of Japan, shifted east 8 feet. It actually changed the rotation of the entire Earth by about a foot during that period. Several thousand people died in the initial shock wave. And of course, there were warnings about a tsunami. People fled uphill. But when it arrived, it still took 20,000 lives. Now, of course, Japan has a very sophisticated tsunami warning system because this kind of event happens over and over. But unfortunately, the earthquake was so severe in this case that it actually topped out the readers. And so the tsunami that was coming didn't appear as large as it actually was on the instruments they were using. But not everybody went completely unwarned. Around Japan, there are scattered about 600 of these. This is a tsunami no ishi, or tsunami stone. And on that stone are written messages like this one. This is one near the village of Aniyoshi in Iwate Prefecture. This says, a residence built high is the relief of our descendants. Remember the great wave, or remember the great tsunami. Do not build a home below here. So these stones impart to these people's descendants a very critical message about listening to what happened to their lives and how the sea took so many from them. And some of these stones date back centuries, and yet scholars who study natural disasters in Japan say that the actual import of the message is lost after about 3 generations. After about 3 generations, usually it's the fishermen who find it troublesome to drive up the mountain every day and back down to the sea. And so they move down into the flat areas near the coast. And then after a while, it seems normal. So other people begin to join them. And then, of course, the inevitable happens and the cycle repeats. So language may not or may be a good medium for the transmission of the value of something. one of the ways in which language could be perhaps a better communicator of what we wish to transmit is if it itself had some intrinsic meaning. And one of the, I guess I would say, the best examples of a knowledge that has its own intrinsic meaning is the practice of science, because it not only tells us stuff, but it also tells us how to learn about more stuff. So let me tell you a story about science. This one begins in 1896. A simple equation. Svante Arrhenius got a D on his dissertation. He got a D, and after a lot of hard work, he improved it to the level of a C. And after a lot more hard work, his dissertation became the basis for a Nobel Prize, which he won in chemistry, which just goes to show you there's always room for improvement. Now, Arrhenius was a savant in some ways. He founded the field of physical chemistry. He formulated the classical definition of what is an acid and what is a base. He came up with an equation that describes the rate of a chemical reaction as a function of temperature relative to absolute zero. He was a proponent of the theory of panspermia, which says that, or which posits that life came from elsewhere in the universe and then landed perhaps on a meteorite onto Earth. And I should add, he was also a eugenicist, which just goes to show you there's always room for improvement. In 1896, Arrhenius came up with a very, very simple model for the temperature of the surface of the Earth. Now, this is a one-line equation, and I'm showing it to you here. This isn't his handwriting, this is mine. This is incredible because right now we use supercomputers to predict more or less the same thing. We use computers with tens of thousands of graphical cores in order to get at the question of what is the Earth's temperature. Of course, those computer simulations are far more sophisticated. They can tell you where on Earth a particular temperature might be. This is just for the average temperature of the Earth. But if I could do it some injustice and write it in word form, basically what we're saying here is that the Earth's surface temperature is a function of absorbed heat and the greenhouse effect plus other factors. And all this brouhaha about climate change and whether it's a myth or not comes down to this term right here, the absorbed heat and the greenhouse gas effect. And this was published in 1896, and Arrhenius believed that, yes, if you were in theory to double the amount of carbon dioxide, it would dramatically increase the temperature of the Earth. He didn't believe that was possible, but we knew it was at least mathematically possible to do. 1938, Guy Callender, British steam engineer, starts to collect from across the world records of temperature and records of atmospheric carbon dioxide, and he shows that they are advancing, they are increasing in lockstep. 1958, Bell Telephone Science Hour announces to the public, and they certainly weren't the only ones, announces to the public that humans might be actually changing climate. 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change formulates and 2 years later releases its first assessment report saying that we are headed to a future where we could add to the average temperature of the Earth about 5.5 degrees by the year 2100, perhaps even worse. And yet today we are emitting greenhouse gases in a sense as if there is no tomorrow. Right now, every single nation has pledged what it believes fair to its contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And even if every single nation were to meet its target, we would still exceed the safety boundaries of the planet. And I'll add, the United States left the agreement just last week. We have known about climate change for over 100 years. This isn't a Chinese hoax. It's solid fact. And to deny it is simply to choose ignorance. So science can transmit something of value. And in and of itself, it is a system that creates value. But of course, you have to adhere to it in order to obtain that value. So science itself is not what's going to transmit, by itself is not what's going to transmit the value of biodiversity. 2103, Common Era. Actually, let's look back in ancient China. If you're up with your history of Kung Fu, you know that there were two main schools of thought. On the one hand, there were the Shaolin school, and the other hand, there was the Wudang or Wu-Tang school, and they were fierce rivals. But actually, I don't want to talk with you about that. I want to talk with you about the Wu-Tang Clan, the fierce school of East Coast hip hop in the 1990s with members such as Ghostface Killah and Old Dirty Bastard. Now, they believed that their art was valuable, but through the process of streaming and so forth, it had become effectively worthless. Let me put it this way. In Beethoven's time, perhaps thousands of people, several thousand people only got to listen to him. And for many of those people, it was a once in a lifetime experience. And for many of those people, they had to go hear Beethoven. He wouldn't have come to them unless they were royalty, of course. Nowadays, for a very low monthly price, I can stream Beethoven 24 hours, 7 days a week to the point where effectively each song is in a sense worthless. So recognizing this fact and lamenting this fact, the Wu-Tang Clan decided to do something to increase the worth of music, or at least some of the music they produced. So over the course of several years, they recorded a single copy album, which they entitled Once Upon a Time in Shaolin. And the agreement was that whoever would purchase this album would not be allowed to play it, at least commercially, for the next 100 years. It was locked into a vault in a Moroccan hotel and then put up for the highest bidder, and it was sold for $2 million to an anonymous person who turned out to be everybody's favorite schmuck, Martin Shkreli. That's right, Martin Shkreli, the once CEO of Turing Pharmaceuticals, who took a life-saving drug and increased the price 5,555% from $13.50 to $750. This is one of those drugs that the World Health Organization declared essential medicines because it helps treat toxoplasmosis and helps prevent death from AIDS. So Martin Shkreli, ironically, given the theme of what we're talking about tonight, decided to turn himself into a living time capsule by committing securities fraud and got himself locked up in federal prison. He'll be released sometime in the year 2024. But as part of that securities fraud investigation, Once Upon a Time in Shaolin, the album was seized by the US government. And at one point, one of the judges said, it's probably worthless. Sometime in the long, long distance future, a band of a few humans will wander across the desert and then come to a forbidden place. And after an anointing ceremony, one of them will proceed forward by herself. She will take with her only a small canteen of water, and for the next 7 days, she will fast, wandering amongst signs of human suffering and grief. She will reside, she will sleep in a forest intended to evoke misery, and she will take with her a cat, a ray cat, which over the course of several days will begin to change color due to the radioactivity of the soil. And she will know when she has her vision because she will hear the screams of humans transmitted through speakers powered by their radioactive decay buried deep below her. So this is obviously fiction, but it's only honestly fiction in the sense that it hasn't really happened yet. Everything I just described was part of a plan commissioned by the Department of Energy for warning future generations about radioactive waste buried beneath Yucca Mountain, Nevada. So here we're talking about radioactive waste with a half-life of 240,000 years. So after just 240,000 years, only half of it will be left, and yet it'll be incredibly dangerous. And so they took great responsibility. They want to transmit to future generations that this is not a place you want to disturb. You do not want to drill here. You do not want to mine here. You do not want to live here. The question, of course, comes in, how do you transmit that message across such time? As we already discussed, language is a really poor way to do that. One of the proposals, which was dismissed, was to write messages like, this is a bad place, do not live here, in as many languages as possible, and also leave on the sign some empty areas for places where future languages might be scrawled. But of course, I could see that quickly being filled up with other important messages, such as, like Mike Heart Sally or Mike Silphium Sally or something like that. Well, those plans were never put into place because the US government decided in the end it's a lot safer to keep all this radioactive waste in casks, which are held above ground, at least for the next couple decades until we really decide what to do with it. But in the meantime, you can buy your very own Raycat t-shirt. And for further education, you can always tune into US Department of Education's Yucca Mountain Johnny, who will teach you all about radioactive waste. So the funnest part about preparing this talk was going through the scores of examples of which I'm aware where humans have attempted to transmit across time messages of great worth, past time that beyond which they had no expectation of their own societies persisting. So in short order, I'm going to run through just a few more examples of those. April 11th, 2019, Beerschot, which means in the beginning, and it's an Israeli lander, approached the moon. It was the first private lander to attempt a moon landing, and on it, it had two remarkable cargoes, one of which was a tardigrade, which you see an image of there. And tardigrades are tiny little eight-legged beasts. They live in mosses and live in ponds. They can actually survive being exposed to naked space. I'm talking about outer space for several minutes. And so the lander took some of them to the moon. So in some sense, we can confirm that there is actually extraterrestrial life. Perhaps the more amazing cargo it had, though, was an entire copy of Wikipedia. And the Wikipedia is encased on plate after plate. Now, if you were to write that out on paper, it would probably fill reams and reams and reams and reams. You couldn't possibly launch all that to the moon without spending billions of dollars. So what they did was they created these plates, and the very topmost plate has a description of how to make a microscope. And the description of how to do that is written in a tiny font, something that you and I could read if we squinted. And once you've made your, magnifying glass, once you've made a magnifying glass, you can read the next plate. And the next plate is written in even smaller font and describes how to create a microscope. And once you've created your microscope, then you can read the next plate. And that describes to you how to read or how to create a microscopic reader. And that allows you to read the rest of Wikipedia, which is written in excruciatingly fine print on thousands and thousands of the remainder of the plates. Alas, Beerschot, the probe, did what they call a very hard landing at several hundred miles an hour, scattered across the surface of the Earth, although honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the tardigrades survived. But don't worry, they'll be launching another one pretty soon. The Future Library. In Norway, there is, in some sense, an ironic project involving cutting down a forest, taking that wood, creating a special room within one of the libraries that's already in existence, and then planting in the place of the original forest a new forest and allowing that to grow for the next 100 years. And then 100 years from now, harvesting that. And every one of those 100 years, a special author will be invited to contribute a manuscript will be stored in that room. Margaret Atwood was actually the first author. And those books will be published in the year 2114 on the paper made from the trees from that future forest. 10,000 Year Clock. This is a project by the Long Now Foundation to make a clock that will run without human interference for 10,000 years, and it will be built on the land of the Amazon. And no, I don't mean the Amazon rainforest. I mean land built by, or land owned by Jeff Bezos. Svalbard Global Seed Vault. This is a seed vault built by Norway on the island of Svalbard. It is literally guarded by polar bears. It's above the Arctic Circle so that even if climate change happens and things really warm up dramatically, the seeds will be held below a temperature that will ensure their preservation. And it's well above sea level so that even if all the ice on Earth were to melt, the seed bank would not be inundated. 500-year experiment, an experiment initiated in the University of Edinburgh to see if 500 years from now we can resuscitate spores of bacteria. And finally, Pioneer plaques. These are plaques attached to Pioneers 10 and 11, the first human-made objects to be given an escape velocity that will allow them to leave to leave the solar system. They are, of course, surpassed by the golden records put on Voyagers 1 and 2, which have now actually left the solar system. And on those records are recordings of the sounds of Earth, from waves crashing to children laughing, a wonderful cacophony. One wonders what aliens will think of that if they actually hear it. And one has to think, if a global catastrophe befalls us, it may be the only thing that we leave in our memory. So here we are at the end. The task before us is to bequeath to our descendants the incredible biological diversity that belongs to the earth. Biodiversity has been around for 3.7 billion years at least. It can persist for billions of years, and yet we are driving species to extinction faster than we can even describe them. In some sense, we know where we want to go with biodiversity. We just have to figure out how to take our biological Lotus Sutra and pass it on to the future. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention, and I believe now we'll have time for questions and answers.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. What a fabulous, fabulous talk. So we do have time for Q&A. So if you have questions for Dr. Smith, feel free to type those in the chat window, and I'll moderate those, and we'll pose your questions to Adam. And then before you leave tonight, we do have a program survey, an online program survey, and we'd love to have you fill that out and let us know what you thought about tonight's talk. You can let us know if there are other topics that you'd like us to cover. So I'm going to go ahead and pop the link for that in the chat window, which I did earlier, but for those of you who joined us later, you might not be able to see that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now before we get started with our Q&A session. And then while I'm doing that, if you want to type your questions in the chat window, I'll go ahead and ask those of Dr. Smith. Okay, so there's the link to our program survey, and we'll go ahead and start with some questions. Okay, let's see, what do we have here? So this is from Howard Granick. Visiting the Weldon Spring site once, we were told that the radioactive material there is supposed to be interred for 10,000 plus years. In light of your message, how should a potentially lethal threat like this be communicated to future generations?
Excellent question. Obviously, if we had to do it all over again, perhaps we wouldn't produce that waste to begin with. Those examples I gave you of the ray cat and signs showing human suffering and things like that, those were all born out of a very niche field called nuclear semiotics. It was all began with a commission established by the Department of Education on how to transmit these messages to future generations. I don't have a good answer, but it is something definitely we are wrestling with. Finland actually right now is attempting to do, in a sense, to make, in a sense, their own Yucca Mountain. They are digging deep, deep down in the earth, and the plan is to finish the caverns they are carving out 200 years from now, and it'll be filled with radioactive waste. And they are going to carve on plates of sapphire, which is really hard to destroy, messages telling future generations what these things are. There have been a number of other ideas for transmitting these messages. One of them would be to put satellites in orbit that constantly transmit the message of where you should not go, so that future generations can hear them, even if our society collapses. As far as Weldon Springs go, honestly, I've been there, and I don't know. It's an incredible juxtaposition on the one hand of the need of the moment and the need of the long now. And that's a problem that we have in not just nuclear waste, but in preservation of biodiversity and preservation of almost anything that we hold dear. I don't have a great answer for you, but I know that we are trying.
Okay, I have another question. This one's from Richard Riley. He's wanting to know if you are you related to the Dr. Smith who stowed away on Lost in Space?
Yes.
Oh,
Hi, Richard. Richard lived next to me, so.
And then we have another question here from Jack Humbing. What gives you hope?
That's an excellent question. Honestly, that's kind of the question of the times, isn't it? It's easy not to have hope. I'll tell you what I try to do. I'm not the best at it, but it's something to continually strive for. I personally, and I don't think you need to be a scientist to do this or even to be a doctor or anything like that. I personally try to be like a good doctor. So on the one hand, you could have a doctor who is overly sensitized. So you are in the waiting or the emergency room, the doctor comes in and says, oh my gosh, the blood, I can't stand it, that's horrible. That's not the doctor you want, obviously. On the other hand, you don't want the doctor that comes in when you're sitting there on the table bleeding to death, the doctor who's completely bored, who's talking about the baseball game and when they get to go home, the doctors who is so completely desensitized. So I think there is, or I try to make personally a balance between being sensitized and the balance between being desensitized, being caring, and yet not being overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. And then honestly, it just comes down to self-care, like running, talking with friends, however that's done over Zoom nowadays, reading things I like to I like to read, and knowing when to stop working, even though I know it's critically important. Yeah, in some sense, it comes down, having hope for the long future comes down to what you do on an everyday basis.
Okay. We have a question from Kylie Hull. What are your thoughts on the new and more sustainable plastics, such as air carbon and using bamboo instead of paper made from trees? Excellent presentation as well, she says.
Oh, thank you. And hi, Kylie. That's a good question. I think on the one hand, we might be able to at least partially invent ourselves out of this mess. So you just gave some great examples of some solutions to the problem of plastic, and we're learning more and more that plastic is one of those kind of forever chemicals. And even though it breaks down to the point where like we may not physically be able to see it with our eyes, we have little microplastic molecules floating around in the oceans. I've heard that on average we each eat, and I can't vouch for the veracity of the statement, but we each eat every month the equivalent of a credit card of plastic in the food that we imbibe. So having solutions like this, like you mentioned, using bamboo to make plastics and things like that, things that will break down fairly easily, is a good way to go. On the other hand, I don't believe that technology will be the only thing that can get us out of this. In fact, it won't just by itself. We also just need change in behavior. And that change in behavior comes at the governmental level, comes at the corporate level, and it comes at the personal level. If just one of those three, or even two of those three attempts to make a change, it won't work. We all need to change. We all need to examine our lives and figure how we can make a difference, not just in the everyday sense, but in the long now sense. Thanks, Kylie.
Here's a question from Donovan. What are your thoughts regarding microplastic waste that seems inevitably part of our future food chain, effect on metabolism of animals and evolution?
Yeah, it's a fascinating experiment that we're running on ourselves. There's this well-known cycle where policy tends to run several decades behind technology. So we invented DDT, and it was only several decades later that policy said, this is something that we don't want to have. We discovered radioactivity, But it wasn't until several decades later we realized how incredibly dangerous it was. And so now, you know, the average person just can't get their hands on anything that's radioactive, hopefully. And so my hope is that the science can catch up fast enough, and people who need to listen will be able to listen. There are steps in the right direction. Certain states are banning plastic bags and things like that, but obviously it needs a wholesale change.
Okay, we have a question from Anna Dmitrieva. Dr. Smith, could you give any details on when and how the seeds stored in the Svalbard Global Seed Vault might be used? Have any of them already been used for restoration?
Yes. So in the Svalbard seed bank were intended to be stored representatives of all the major and minor world food crops, so that, for example, if some disease were to wipe out all of corn, we could go there and get some corn back, because God help us if we ran out of corn. And it was thought that these seeds would be useful perhaps just in case, decades, maybe hundreds of years from now. But as it's turned out, every year, my understanding is about 4 times per year, there is a request for seeds from the seed bank because certain varieties are on the verge of extinction or they have gone extinct. So the Svalbard seed bank has turned out to be far more useful than it was originally envisioned.
We have another question from Ella Nolan. In your opinion, what is the most crucial thing people can do in their everyday lives to have a positive environmental impact?
I guess, like I was saying earlier, try to, especially now with the pandemic, do what you need to do to stay as happy as you can. I've talked to people in my field in conservation biology who go to see professional therapists because it is so overwhelming. They call it ecological grief. And there are more and more cases of this. So, for example, people in Greenland are watching their world literally melt away. And it is a very difficult thing to witness. So it's very, very easy to get overwhelmed. But like I said, I think we do have a bias toward the negative. Nobody would tune into the news if it were something like, today, nothing really happened. You know, we tend to have this negativity bias, and it always seems the world is getting worse and worse and worse. And yet, over the past few decades, things have gotten, in some senses of the word, much better. The percentage of people in absolute poverty has actually declined dramatically. The number of people dying from preventable diseases has actually declined dramatically, pandemic notwithstanding. So they're all kinds of notes of improvement, and it's easy to focus on the negative things. Like I said, though, personally, I struggle going back and forth between these opposites of being too sensitized and being desensitized, and somewhere in the middle, there's a happy medium.
This is a question from Mark. He says, great talk. Regarding nuclear waste, is there any viability of reuse in any other capacity? If ever safe to transport to space, would allow for a new dynamic of engineering for interplanetary, interstellar transportation?
Yeah, I agree. Nuclear energy certainly has its purposes. A lot of the probes that I mentioned actually have small nuclear reactors, in a sense, on them, powering them, because they're so far from the sun. Solar panels just would not work. So in that sense, nuclear energy offers us potentially great promise. The problem is when it's here on Earth. If I understood what you said, Rose, Mark was asking about if we launched nuclear waste into space. Is that right?
Yes, if ever safe to transport to space.
Oh,
Yep.
I see. In theory, yes. If we could put it on the far side of the moon or something like that, that would be awesome. The danger, though, comes into the fact that I don't know the stats, but rockets aren't fail-safe. They're getting more and more reliable. But if you think about it, given the hundreds and thousands of tons of waste that we've got, all you need, and then the hundreds of launches you would need to take that away from the Earth, all you need is just one to blow up, one of those rockets to have a malfunction, and you've got a major nuclear calamity on your hands. So honestly, I do think underground is probably the best place to put it.
And I think this is our last question for the evening. Unless anybody else has additional questions, feel free to go ahead and type them into the chat window. This one is from Richard Riley. He's wanting to know if a recording of tonight's talk will be shareable. So we did record this evening. If we make this available, it would probably be sometime late next week before it's before you're able to access it. So generally we post Academy of Science talks on our YouTube channel at Academy of Sci STL. So that's where you would be able to find it. And do we have any other questions from anyone this evening? Let's see. This one's from Donovan. COVID has overwhelmed us. We won't fix global warming until it overwhelms us. Do you think democracy is a really viable tool, or will a tyranny have to make the necessary decisions?
Oh boy, easy questions tonight. The problem with tyranny is that it's tyranny. You know, obviously what you would want is an enlightened philosopher king, but if there's one lesson that I've tried to transmit is that things change. And so forms of government, which may work out very well now, could ultimately be corrupted in whatever sense. The world has actually come together to agree to limit climate change. And by the world, I mean countries that are run by authoritarian dictators to countries that are full democracies, even more democratic than us. So I don't believe that it requires a particular form of government. It probably requires a different kind of economy and different, like I said earlier, different personal behavior, different corporate behavior, and different governmental behavior.
Okay, we have another question. This is from Taz Khan. What is the most impactful thing we can do in daily life to aid conservation? For example, recycling or not using plastic bags or using less electricity?
That's an excellent question. Let me pretend like I'm your medical doctor for a little bit, and I'll say, you need to stop eating as much red meat as you do. And let me be a conservation biologist for a second, which I am, and say, we need to stop eating as much red meat as we do. Eating red meat is bad for your heart, so it's a personal gain if you don't eat as much as you do. But it's actually one of the most impactful things that we do, because cows, which is where we get most of our red meat, take up a lot of space. And you could grow much more food on the land that the cows occupy in the form of plants than you can actually grow cows. What more, cows, well, honestly, they fart. I have a friend who's writing a book, Ari Chandler, called Farts Are Forever. And her point is that when the methane from a fart enters the atmosphere, it has long-term effects. Because methane is a very, very potent greenhouse gas, much more than carbon dioxide. So in a word, the simplest thing we can do is one of the best things we can do for our own health, and that is simply eat less red meat.
Okay, I have a comment. This is from Mary Fell. She says, great talk. I think the planet will survive if we believe all of our past science. I think our current species will not survive, and we should spend our last days and money trying to learn how to live in a changing climate, as in adapt.
Amen. There's a tension between those who say we need to mitigate, that is reduce climate change and focus there, and others with saying it's a lost cause, we need to adapt, accept what comes. I think it takes a plurality, honestly. There's going to have to be some of both. I will mention one of the, I call it positive things I've seen out of climate change is that more and more on graphs, the kind of scientific graphs I kind of look at from day to day, more and more of these graphs have time on them, a year, and that year the last year on the graph might be 2100, but lately I've seen ones that go out to the year 2800 or even the year 10,000, meaning that scientists are taking this longer and longer view. And I think that's necessary, not just for dealing with climate change, but for dealing with things like we talked about tonight, the preservation of biodiversity.
We have a question from Lizzie Braver. Of all of the attempts to try and communicate to our future selves that you mentioned in the presentation. Which is your favorite, and which do you believe will be the most effective, and why?
The breeding of the ray cats, that is cats that would turn a certain color if they're exposed to radioactivity. I thought that was hilarious. And then I don't think I made this point clear. Just having an animal change color doesn't tell you very much if you don't know what that means. The idea would be to found a priesthood modeled on the Catholic Church that would preach the gospel of radioactivity. And when you saw these cats run, because that signifies some sort of evil, it's one of the most fantastic kind of out there ideas. And yet, if you look at human history, if you remember those graphs I showed earlier, in some sense, one of the most effective ways to transmit a message is through the form of religion. And yet, I think we can all realize that religion isn't foolproof. That's why we have so many different sects of each major religion, hundreds and thousands of them, because nobody can agree on what the message is. Nonetheless, there is a message being transmitted through faith. So I think that idea is probably my favorite. I don't know if it's workable, but in some sense, we're already doing it.
Okay. If that's the last question, that's up in the chat window. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Smith, for speaking with us tonight. What a wonderful talk. If you would all like to let us know what you thought about tonight's event, please fill out the online program survey. You can let us know there as well if there are topics that you'd like us to present in the future. And thank you all for joining us this evening. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. And I think with that, unless we have any other questions, it doesn't look like it. I think we're gonna go ahead and end our presentation this evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. Great talk.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Night all.